with the Trump administration right now being formed and just picking new people for his administration, do you think that the Middle Eastern countries, the West Asia countries, are getting to the point that the solution for the conflict in Gaza and in Lebanon, as you mentioned, MBS was talking about it, and all of the leaders are talking about it, and do you think that they're getting to the point that they would consider the solution is in the Middle East, is not in the United States, and the role that the United States can play in the Middle East? Because at the end of the day, we know how much of leverage the Netanyahu and Israelis have on Washington.
I think people already recognize that to a large degree, but many of these regimes are bound to the United States. Their elites, their leaders were trained in the West. They have palaces in the West. They have assets in the West. They spend their vacations there. They send their families there. They send their children there to study. And probably, if they feel they're about to be overthrown, they have plans to live in the West. So many of these countries or these regimes in the Persian Gulf region or in West Asia, they are, they're stuck with the United States. But at the same time, they also, the elites recognize that the United States is not the power that they thought it to be. For example, when Aramco was struck, the United States wasn't able to do anything about it. In fact, the reason why the war between Yemen and Saudi Arabia came to an end, the genocidal war, which Trump supported, but of course Obama did too. This genocidal war, the reason why it failed ultimately, and the Saudis had to accept a ceasefire, was because Yemen was increasingly striking Saudi oil assets, and the Americans couldn't do anything about it. So gradually, as we move forward, elites in the Persian Gulf region in West Asia increasingly understood the limits of U.S. power. And as we've been moving forward, especially in the last 3 years, especially after Ukraine, and then, of course, the events in Palestine, I think not only did they see U.S. power diminish, but in general, Western soft power was destroyed. The populations across the region are extremely hostile towards Western governments, European governments, North American governments, because they're behind the Holocaust. So it's very difficult for these leaders that are bound to the West to ignore these. And they know that in order to stay in power, they have to be very careful about their population. They also recognize that the power of the United States is sort of like melting ice. So they are seeking to change the nature of their relationship with countries like Iran, Russia, China, among others. But you do see, for example, in the fact that Saudi Arabia, on the one hand, it wants to carry out naval maneuvers with Iran, which is an interesting step. But on the other hand, Saudi Arabia has still refrained from actually joining BRICS, even though it's been invited. So I think that's sort of reflective of where Saudi Arabia stands, and so do other countries in the region. I think that's like an interesting example of how it is. But the difference is that a decade ago, these countries would have been literally on their knees for the Americans. When Trump came in, people across the region were ridiculing the Persian Gulf regimes, because they were seen as being milked by Trump, and that's something that he was bragging about. But I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for him to do what he did in the past, because so many things have changed since he left office.
We had a new video message from Netanyahu again to Iranian people. He's trying to convince people to rise up against the government in Iran. Do you think recently the new Minister of Defense of Israel, it is called Israel Katz, if I'm not mistaken, he said that they're going to attack nuclear facilities in Iran. And how do you find the rhetoric on their part right now and the way they're talking? If you remember, whenever they wanted to talk Gaza, Lebanon, they send a video message, then they start attacking Lebanon or Gaza. And right now they're doing the same with Iran. How did you find it?
In the West, they have for decades they've been saying that the Israelis know this region very well, and the Israelis have always been famous for understanding the so-called Arab mind. Very racist term, but anyway. But I think it just shows that the Israelis actually don't understand the region, and probably they understand it even less than Western elites, which is saying a lot. The West is really clueless about our region. Just watching their elites in think tanks speak, or reading their articles, or watching some of them online or on television, I think shows how uh, their analysis is based on um, wishful thinking and what they want to believe, or what their funders want them to say or want to believe. And the Israelis, I think, are worse than most, if not all, of those in the West. One for example, in the West, they say the Arabs, and we always hear how the Arabs and the Israelis want peace, and they want to cooperate, and they want to be allies. But they're talking about a few Arab dictatorships. The population in the United Arab Emirates is hostile towards the Israeli regime. In Bahrain, it's hostile towards the Israeli regime. In Qatar and Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, they're all very hostile, or in Egypt. But Western elites somehow equate the ruling families with the entire population of the country, which I think is a very dangerous way to look at things. The Israeli regime has not only, in my opinion, uh, not miscalculated when it struck Gaza, because initially they said we're going to starve them. And they were very open about their genocidal intent, as we all know. They said very openly that they're Amalek, and looking to the biblical, the Old Testaments, we see that the Amalek were completely wiped out: women, children, animals, everything. So they're subhuman to the Israelis. They said we're going to cut off water, we're going to cut off food, medicine, electricity, fuel, everything. And that there are no innocents, as the Israeli president said, in Gaza. But they miscalculated. It's well over a year and they've still failed to take Gaza. In fact, they've had significant casualties over the last 72 hours. This is the regime that was able to go all the way to the Suez very swiftly once upon a time, or in Lebanon too. They failed. They failed to take anything in Lebanon. They slaughter people, which is again is a miscalculation, because every airstrike further angers people across the region, and fingers are pointed not just towards Israel, but towards London, towards Paris, towards Associated Press, towards Reuters, towards CNN, because people see all of these as a part of this effort to destroy the region, to justify the destruction of the region, to protect ethno-supremacism. An ethno-supremacism which really it's a mythological ethnicity, because Jews from Europe are not Semites. Even Jews from Morocco and other parts of the Arabic world are not Semites. The Semites are the Palestinians, who are overwhelmingly non-Jewish. But in any case, the world, the region sees the West as being behind this. So all of these actions by the Israeli regime are miscalculations. And what they did is the exact opposite. They have united the region in a way in which we have never seen before. This is very important, Nima. The meeting of leaders that you alluded to at the very beginning of our discussion is important. The fact that the statements are becoming more harsh. Before the president of Syria and the president of Algeria and the Iranians and a few others were making tough statements. Now it's almost becoming universal. And this is, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you see populations converging. For decades now, the Israeli regime has been trying to divide the region, the Israelis and the Americans and the Europeans, through their embassies, through their governments, through official policy, through NGOs. They've been trying to, through their proxies, local governments, despots, through racism, Arab, Persian, Turk, Kurd, through sectarianism, Shia, Sunni, through religion, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, always trying to create divisions so that they could impose their hegemony more easily. And now we see that there is total unity among many populations in the region. And when I say total unity, I'm looking at the resistance in the surrounding areas around Palestine, and I find that to be amazing, absolutely stunning, and how popular the resistance has become, how views towards Iran has changed, especially when Ayatollah Khamenei gave his famous Friday prayer speech, and he gave the second sermon in Arabic, which was broadcast across the Arabic world live. It had a huge impact. And this is largely due to the policies of the Israeli regime. Its own stupidity has created this awakening and brought these people together. And the same is true inside Iran. The United States and the Europeans have done a lot of work over the years to create division in Iran. Through terrorism, through funding different groups, through the sanctions. The sanctions have been brought about to crush Iranian civil society, just like in Venezuela, just like in Cuba, and to create anger and despair so that people would rise up against the government, and so that the Americans and the West could install a regime that's to their liking. That's basically what the policy has always been with sanctions. That's what they tried with Russia as well. They tried to turn the ruble into rubble and basically undermine the state and undermine Russia. It failed, but they do cause discontent and violence in countries, and that includes Iran. But what has happened over the last year, because of the genocide in Gaza, is that people in Iran, especially young people, who I once mentioned, a lot of young people who do not have a strong sense of history, especially after Corona, a lot of these young people felt that Iran was the problem, and that the West wants peace and stability, and they support human rights and human values, and that Iran has a grudge, and that it's the so-called regime in Iran that is the troublemaker. And if it wasn't for this regime in Tehran, we would have peace and stability and friendship with Europe. Some of these people were among my own undergraduate students, mostly undergraduate students, like between 17, 16 to 22, 21, that age. There were lots of young people in that age group. The last year has destroyed the image of the West. It has destroyed the image of the Israeli regime. People don't consider the West to be have anything to do with human rights. They see them as the greatest enemy of human rights and human dignity and women's rights and children's rights. And so I think that Netanyahu really doesn't understand where things stand in the region today. He has been able to slaughter many people. He has been able to ruin the lives of families. You wake up in the morning and you see images of a woman who's lost her husband and all her children. Or you hear of a man who went out to buy bread and he comes back and everyone has been killed. You hear these, or you see the images of dead people lying around every day. This pleases the Israelis from what we see and hear from their Telegram channels and how they enjoy this, but they are destroying themselves and they're uniting the region and they're uniting people within countries in the region against the Israeli regime. So I think that Netanyahu's statement, any statement that he makes, whether it's towards the Lebanese people or the Iranian people or the people of Yemen, it's only going to be ridiculed if it doesn't have the opposite effect. I don't even think people take it serious enough for it to have the opposite effect. But and Lebanon is another good example. The West has always tried very hard, as well as their regional proxies, to divide Lebanon. And that is what the dirty war in Syria was about. The West tried to undermine Syria because Syria was the only country in the region, the only government surrounding around the Israeli regime that was resisting Israel. So the West and their regional allies and proxies tried to undermine it. The same policy was always pursued in Lebanon. So you saw divisions that were sectarian based, often racially based, because they tried to depict the resistance as Iranian and not non-Arab, or not. So that has been going on for a very long time. Now the sectarianism has been cast aside. Palestinians support Hezbollah. The Sunni, I mean, you always had people, you had Sunnis who supported Hezbollah, those who were opposed to Hezbollah, those who were influenced by the West and the Saudis and others, and then the Christian community and the Druze community. They're always trying to keep them divided, but now you see everyone has been aligned, and the West is desperately trying to use their ally, people like Samir Jaja and others who were actually implicated, who were involved in the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982, where 3,500 Palestinians and Shia were slaughtered by these militias supported by the Israeli regime that had occupied Beirut. These are the allies of the United States in Lebanon. The rest of Lebanon, for the most part, is hostile towards the Israeli regime. So what Israel has done, what the United States has done, what the EU has done, what the British and the Canadians have done, is that they brought unity to this region at different levels that was non-existent before. And I think that will have major implications in the weeks and months ahead. And again, another point that we have to remember is that this does not bode well for regimes that are pro-American. Does not bode well for them. They can, what we saw over a decade ago in North Africa, in Tunisia, when a young man burned himself alive, we saw how it shook the whole region. Right now, pro-American regimes should be far more fearful of the streets than they were back then.
Yeah. The finance minister of Israel is talking about the annexation of the West Bank. In his eyes, Donald Trump's presidency would facilitate the process of annexation of Gaza, of the northern part of Gaza, the West Bank. Do you think that with what we've seen so far, we know that the Middle Eastern country or the West Asian countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, all these are talking about the problem that they're facing in Gaza and in Lebanon. But the way even with Saudi Arabia in this summit, MBS said that they have to, he was calling that they have to consider, their concern is the problem in Gaza and in Lebanon, both of them. And they're not considering any sort of, even with Saudi Arabia, relationship with the government in Israel. as long as they're having the problem of Gaza and Lebanon, and there is no, as long as that there is no possibility of having a Palestinian state. If they go in that direction, if they go in the policy of annexation, and Donald Trump, we know that Donald Trump, the behavior of Donald Trump would help them, would just support them, whatever they want to do. But what the Islamic countries can do in order to just make some sort of warning for the administration in Washington?
I agree. I think that Trump would most probably view any such annexation favorably.